RHS.
Yeah. Yeah. People are, a lot of Malaysia could easily invade it. But it's not worth the effort. The loss would be much huge. It's just like Hitler didn't go into Switzerland for the same reason.
Okay, it's a little bit after 10 after, so we should get started. Welcome back to another semester of Csaaw. My name is Jon Atwell. I'm co-director along with Sinead Barr, who's joining, or rather, taking on co-directorship this semester, replacing Zeb. As you've no doubt noticed, we've changed the time of week we're doing this, and that has put our schedule into a state of confusion. We have people lined up, so we don't have that up yet and finalized. We hope to do that very soon, perhaps in like the next week. We'll send that out. A lot of you guys to playing around that stuff. I'm just going to quickly pass around a sign-in sheet, for the lack of a better word. This is just so that we can tell the people who help us buy lunch that we have people here. So if you wouldn't mind putting your name on it, we will keep doing this next year. Any other things we should mention? Yeah, so we have 1 or 2 more open days. So if you have any work that you are interested in putting in front of the group, as you probably know, no need to be very polished. This is more about getting some good input as the project is developing, so don't feel like you need to have some pristine shape. If you are interested and willing, feel free to talk to either one of us to figure out what might work. Okay, so my name is Jon Atwell. I'm in the Department of Sociology. I'm also here at the Center for the Study of Complex Systems. And today I'm going to share with you some work that I've actually presented in front of this group maybe 2 years ago at this point, but a lot has changed since then, thanks to the input of some people here. And I'm excited to present it again. It's still changing at this point. In the email I sent out, I talked a little bit about niche construction and distributed cognition, some terms that I'm using to hang some of my ideas on. I haven't really worked those into the talk yet, but hopefully I'll come around to that a bit later and explain what I think that's doing. Get your thoughts on that. So tentatively, I'm calling this project Markets as Sites of Constructive Processes. So as a sociologist, I'm actually an economic sociologist. I'm interested in economic phenomena. And our particular take on it is a bit different than a lot of people's, a lot of disciplines rather. We definitely, within our discipline, we think that there's a lot of uncertainty about markets. The status of markets in sociology is that, yes, they're absolutely essential to organizing capitalist societies, but they're also socially embedded. So the sort of canonical version of market theory is that it's some sort of freestanding mechanism that's able to do a lot of organizing by itself. We agree with that, but argue that the individuals who constitute that mechanism are social embedded, meaning that they have cultural backgrounds, sets of ideas, social networks that they are in, and those things help influence the outcomes of market processes. So that's one of our core tenets. I think that's pretty amenable to the complex systems perspective. But at this point, there's still a lot of room for more theoretical work about markets as social mechanisms. But what I want to do is to shift focus to the nature of market participation and the fact that there is actually a lot of uncertainty in markets, which is a 2-part ontological claim. Everyone knows that there is lots of uncertainty in markets. We usually talk about this in terms of Nike uncertainty, which is opposed to risk. Risk is something that's somehow measurable and more anticipatable. Uncertainty, then, is something where it's not so much measurable. It's just an unknown. That's certainly present in markets. But I do want to emphasize that that type of uncertainty isn't necessarily just about the knowledge that people have. It it could be the fact that the system is in fact open, meaning that there isn't anything to know yet because the particular structure of the market has yet to be determined. So I think all of us remember when smartphones first started coming on the market, there was great uncertainty about it, not just because you didn't know things about it, but because the system of which they are a part hadn't really been established yet. You didn't know the utility of it, the value of it. So there's both those types of uncertainty in markets. Not all markets, though, are disordered or uncertain, but I would argue that at some point they are. When they are first arising, they're going to be disordered. Sometimes later when there's some sort of interruption, exogenous shock, if you will. That means that there's openness in the system. Still more than minimal eventual entropy. And I should actually say between minimal and maximal entropy, maximal entropy is the order of a certain sort that's certainly relevant. But when there's some structure but it's not fully codified, it's a particular type of openness I'm interested in. What that means is that actors can't know the value of particular choices. These values are not yet established. And I think that this type of uncertainty is experienced by actors much the same as the traditional likelihood uncertainty. But from our perspective as complex system modelers, we probably want to say that it is in fact a different type of uncertainty in the system. So what does this uncertainty mean for action? How we think about participation in markets? So I would argue that behavior is not rational. And when I say rational, I mean it in a very canonical sense. There have been many reformulations of rational choice theory and extensions to it, all very valuable, but I'm a sociologist, so I like to set up straw men. And I'll just say that behavior is not rational in a canonical way. Sociologists, though, often like to talk about scripts for action, meaning, okay, we aren't rational, but maybe we have these cultural scripts that tell us what we should do. When there's openness in the system, scripts don't really make sense. Scripts require some sort of practice being successful for them to sort of become enshrined as culturally viable. So that sort of presupposes an order. So from a sociological perspective, we don't want to say that there's scripts that people have, they aren't rational, but they already know what to do nonetheless. Therefore, I'd argue that behavior is about experimentation and learning. Again, because the environment is disordered between minimal and maximal entropy, behavior can actually increase orderness, though. So if action is about experimenting and learning, you're going and doing things in the world. Maybe when you were interested in the smartphone, you didn't know exactly its utility to you, but you nonetheless got one to sort of figure out what it was. The cost of experimenting was not high. The effects of that experimenting, though, is starting to introduce order into the system. So that experimenting process can actually increase orderness. So what I'm trying to do at this point, that's just sort of a setup, is make an argument that markets are sites of some sort of process. I've had a hard time finding a term that I really like to put here. When I first started conceiving of this sort of framework, I started thinking about terms like creation versus discovery, and I was sort of enjoying thinking to myself, walking around and telling people that I'm a creationist. My advisors told me that was not advisable. Structuring, generative, intersubjective. I've sort of settled on constructive for the moment, meaning that it's an order-producing process based on the history of social exchange. Furthermore, the consequence of this can be a convergence between behavior, incentives, and informational structures. I'm open to any suggestions you guys have about what word I should use to describe the process that I've yet to describe. But for now, I'm saying constructive processes. Markets are sites of constructive processes. What I hope to accomplish with this at this point is to convince readers who are mostly sociologists. That's how my academic identity, so I'm pitching it largely to them, I'm obviously interested in what you guys think. Hopefully, this area is worthy of more attention. Toward that end, what I've done is developed a basic model of constructive process and decision making, and then used that and looked at an empirical case that shares similarities with quality to sort of show this way of modeling this process is perhaps insightful. And I actually made two agent-based models that sort of encode different ways of thinking about the problem, try to show that one of them actually might do a better job explaining. So this model, for me, needs a theory of creative action. This is the experimentation and learning. There are a couple different ways I can go there, at least as a sociologist. Pragmatism is a philosophical framework that has a lot of rich material to draw on. There are other ones for using approaches involving habitus. But furthermore, I need some sort of collective dynamics of that creative action. And because of that, I've sort of settled on pragmatism for the moment. These are big words to attach to pretty simple concepts, but sometimes it's helpful to be citing some illustrious scholars when you're making your argument. So I'm talking about pragmatism. And about the empirical case, I should be clear in setting this up that sometimes when people think about empirical agent-based models, they think about really trying to capture everything about reality and somehow dock it, get to the point where you are able to tweak parameters and get different predictions and possibly go back to reality and do that. That's not what I'm trying to do. This model is very simple, and the goal is to show that this particular model probably would do, it has a higher probability of producing the observed outcome than a different model. So I'm just saying, here's our standard model. With some probability, it could produce the outcome that we observed. Here's this alternative model. Its probability is in fact higher, but it would be the process that generated this outcome. Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about what you mean by creative action?
Yeah. Creative action, well, let me just go on to the next slide, because the particular model I'm using around the philosophical framework is pragmatism creative action. So this draws on some prominent scholars who have been here at the University of Michigan and also the University of Chicago, George Herbert Mead, Charles Peirce, John Dewey, and William James. I believe it was Mead and Dewey who met here at the University of Michigan. But typically they're associated with what's called the Chicago School. Not to be confused with the Chicago School of Economics. But pragmatist philosophy was really a rejection of the Cartesian method, which is an appeal to first principles in order to understand the world. What can we possibly know about the world? Descartes said we can really only know that I'm here because I'm asking this question. They argue that's a really pretty crappy spot to start an inquiry into the social world. And that we should actually just take a lot more for given, or as given. So the concept of truth no longer expresses a correct representation of reality and cognition, which can be conceived of using the metaphor of copy. Rather, it expresses an increasing power to act in relation to the environment. So as individuals, as we're going around trying to make sense of the world, our brains aren't creating exact copies of the world and then running the models and giving the outcomes. We're collecting data that help us relate to the world and have an increased power in that world. So it is to say that there's a lot of stuff we don't know, but what matters is our ability to operate in the world. And that, in many ways, they argue is creative action. You are actually creating something when you're going out into the world and interacting with it in that way. You aren't merely having copies of it. And this really starts to get at sort of the niche construction aspect of this project. that when there's openness in the system and we are experimenting in it, learning about it, we are also simultaneously creating that system. Just a little note at the bottom, pragmatists have written a lot, and I've read some of it, but not all of it, so I'm drawing on some secondary work, and really using their work to stuff. So, pragmatist theory offers a really nice model of embedded creativity. The actors are informed of rational, but rather they engage in abductive learning. Abductive learning is just, you have some assumption about the world, you use that assumption to act in the world, and you get some sort of feedback from that, and then you update. That's abductive learning. Furthermore, this group would argue that there's the generalized other. As social individuals, when you're thinking about the world, you often find yourself thinking in relation to what others are doing. But others is a generalized other. I don't necessarily think about what John Holland's doing when I'm thinking about psychology, but I have some idea about a generalized psychologist and might direct my actions toward my understanding of that generalized other. So it's very socially referenced. Not only are you creative actors, but socially referenced creative actors. And this pretty simple setup, there's obviously a lot more to it, has many of the features that I need for my model. But that's just at the individual level. You also need the group dynamics of pragmatic learning, if you will. And for that end, I'm drawing a lot on the work that I've done here. Some of you might be familiar with John Padgett, and also some work that Bob Savage here in the physics department, as well as Rick and Maria Riolo have done on stigmergy, which is environmentally mediated transfers of information. A lot of times when social scientists talk about behavior, or social behavior, it's always embedded in a network. And get into fun and complicated questions about topologies of networks, how information flows over that. But at this point, I'm really only interested in this question of the external environment. So in markets, you do not have social ties to all other market participants, but you are nonetheless getting information about what they're doing. I would argue stigmergically through the shared environment that you're operating in. So back to the cell phone example, you're observing others doing things with their phones. That's perfectly viable information when you're thinking about when you're updating your beliefs about the world. Despite the fact that you may not have a social tie, an obvious direct social tie to them, or even a distant one. Stigmergy exhibits some pretty strong patterns of self-reinforcing loops, and what we would talk about is co-constitution of actors in environments. And stigmergic processes we've shown in these models are very good at producing order in the environment. So you can have a very open system and have individuals experimenting with what they are going to do. That experimentation structures the environment in some way, and that opens up channels of information for others to see and learn from. And that is sufficient to produce order in the system. Okay, so to jump to what I've actually done, here I'll start describing the first model, the sort of baseline model. So when I talk about cell phones and what the question of whether to adopt them, the sort of basic model that most people will bring to mind is that of network externalities. This is a model that economists would use that would just say, yes, you have preferences, but sometimes your preferences depend upon the actions of others. Therefore, there's this network externality, where your behavior depends on the behavior of others. Pretty simple model. Going back even further, original telephones, when people were adopting NAT, it didn't make sense for you to be the first person to have the phone. Others had to have phones as well in order to make sense for you to have them. So that's a very simple model, very helpful model. It is related, if not identical, to what in sociology is called the threshold model. The idea here being, say you're in a crowd somewhere and someone starts to riot. You could assume that everyone has a threshold for rioting, and therefore your behavior depends on what everyone else is doing. And the question becomes, if everyone has a threshold for that, what are the long-term dynamics? What has to happen in the beginning? If everyone would riot, or if there's no riot? That's a sort of basic question. And that's really, I think, the same model as network externalities. They both have thresholds and depend on at what point, given your preferences, will you change from doing one thing to doing another. And I built a very simple AE-based model of this problem. So the decision is simple. The actor is maximizing between A or B action. And these, the utilities, rather, for these actions are defined thusly. You have a gamma, AA, or AB, BB, or BA, where gamma JK is the actor's belief about the reward of a particular type of interaction. That, however, though, is weighted by what other people are doing. What other people are doing, though, is a sample that you get from the environment. So say you have some beliefs, some gammas, and you want to see whether it makes sense for you to get a smartphone. So you at some point just start observing what's going on in the world, sort of counting to yourself how many people you see who have smartphones versus how many don't. And you take that, you have some idea about your utility if you both have smartphones versus when you don't, or if you have one and they don't, or they have one and you don't. You just apply your sample of the frequency in the environment to get your expected utility of having that or not. Yeah.
Could you just expound upon the second term a little bit more?
Each here?
Yeah. No, like the addition, like where the if you have one and they don't. I think, yeah.
So say this is having a cell phone.
Yeah.
Your utility of having a cell phone is, and this is maybe a bad example, but if you both have it times, so your belief about the value of this to you, if you both have it, times the number of people who have it out there. So that gives you sort of expected number of interactions where you both have it. But then you might have a utility related to you having it and them not having it. Okay. So the probability of them having
smaller than the first term.
I'm sorry?
Is that usually the coefficient for that usually smaller?
It's entirely open.
Okay.
Yeah. To give you perhaps a better example, and this is where I'm going with the empirical case, is to think about it in terms of automobile safety. So it turns out this is not true empirically, but say you assume that having an SUV makes you safer than being in a car. So you have some belief about you both being in an SUV times the number of people who have SUVs compared to you having an SUV and no one else, or the other person in this random interaction not having an SUV, times the probability of that interaction. So that gives you your utility of having an SUV versus having a car.
So you can turn that into a prisoner's dilemma.
Yep. Yep.
Would be just answer the question, but are these gammas, do they remain static throughout the
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So
You mentioned some updating would be going on there.
that's the comparison.
Okay.
So right now, this is the sort of standard model of microeconomics. Everyone has utilities. We don't need to explain where they come from. We assume that there's some diversity typically, and then we see what aggregates from that. So this is a very simple model, and you can a little bit more about the sampling process. So every delta time steps, the person, after collecting the sample, seeing what other people are doing, makes a decision. So you see that sample, make a decision, clear out your memory, start counting again. So that's the dynamic. Because the beliefs are just fixed preferences, really, you can calculate a unique threshold for everyone given their assumed preferences. And then the question just reduces to whether the sample of A is greater than T, this threshold, if If it is, choose A, otherwise choose B. So in terms of an experiment, what I did with that was vary delta sum, and then I varied the initial fraction of A. So if everyone's doing A, there's really no reason to change anything. It will just stay where it is. So what matters is what happens when it's not 0A or fully saturated A. So that's why I'm varying here, here. And these circles represent, and this is pretty crude, a measure of path dependency. So I assume initial conditions, which here is just people's preferences drawn from uniform distribution. And then I see what happens if we change the ordering in which they interact. So do the same initial conditions, did 30 times, see where the system ends up once you let it run, which equilibrium points it gets to, and count those up. So if it always gets to the same equilibrium every time for that initial condition, its path dependency score is 1. If it never gets to the same one, it would be 0. And then I average that over 15 sets of different initial conditions to get this, which is, if it's a full sphere, that means that every single time for various initial conditions, it ended up at the same equilibrium, which is usually saturation of 1 or another. These ones here with the darker lines around it are less than 1. I need to devise a better way of representing this information, but it's circle size. So these ones you can see, they can end up, the same initial condition can end up at different equilibrium points, just based on the ordering in which people interact.
What about different initial conditions winding up at the same or near the same equilibrium?
That's entirely possible, and I know that it does happen because usually it's saturation of one or the other, but I haven't really formalized it.
It just seems like if that is happening, then that would play into how you would characterize something as happening. Like,
Agreed. But I'm not on that.
Why are you interested in equilibrium?
I'm not interested in which, but the question for me is whether the system is dependent upon the interactions between individuals. So if it always ends up at the same point, it would seem possible to say that the system really isn't dependent upon the interactions. What really matters is just people's preferences. We'll get to the same
I was
point.
thinking about oscillation.
Okay.
What the system oscillates in different
That would be fascinating. This very simple model doesn't do that.
Does it?
Yeah. So looking at this, there isn't a whole lot of path dependency. Obviously, it's more sensitive to it when it's a 50-50 split. So you start the model, there are a bunch of cars and a bunch of trucks on the road. It could go either way. It depends on local interactions. If someone happens to see a bunch of trucks in their sample, they're going to go truck and skew the distribution and end up at different points. Obviously, as you go further this direction, though, it's hard to move away out of that basement of attraction.
Let me say really quickly, you said we're looking at what the distribution of the gammas, because it seems to me, just thinking about oscillation, you add high weight on the off terms, right?
Yep.
Maybe you would sort of have a naive expectation of including oscillation. So are we sort of assuming?
They're all, each one of them is sampled from the same uniform distribution.
Okay. So but it's still the case that you don't see everything settles down, it's just a matter of which one it settles down to.
Yep.
Okay, good. No oscillation.
Okay, so that was a very quick, sort of naive model of thresholds or network externalities. But as a sociologist, I want to think that people they don't just come to a situation with they might come into a situation with fundamental preferences, meaning what they really want over the long run, but they might have different instrumental preferences and they're willing to update those, change their mind about how to best get what they really want. So I'm looking at some sort of creative learning model. And very similar setup, but rather than just have a fixed single point gamma here, each time they get to make a decision, we actually sample a gamma from a random variable distribution. It's just a range, fixed width. So to give a local example, maybe some of you haven't been to Amherst, but if you have, I don't know, 90 sandwiches. If you're going in trying to figure out what the best sandwich is there, you're going to have to sample some different things, and your beliefs might change over time, especially if there's some variation in quality. So I think it's fair to say that there's some bounds and certainty about what the best sandwich is there. Usually it's not a fixed point. You need to sample over it, and sometimes you're going to just try different things. So that's my argument for having this setup, where it's bounded distribution every sample. But otherwise, identical setup. I lied, that's not true. So they can update this. Let me just sketch it out. So say this is gamma AA, and same as in the other model, we start with some just bound around here. So this is this actor's original distribution for, say, this right here. Based on what others are doing, they can update their certainty about this. So if they're doing A, and everyone else is doing A around them, they're going to become more certain that this is the optimal behavior, and we'll shrink this. If they're doing the opposite of everyone else, we'll expand this distribution. So it would increase their uncertainty about what the best course of action is. Does that make sense?
And each time step?
Not in each time step, each time they are able to make a decision.
Okay, and each time that they make a decision, that value is chosen randomly within that range.
Correct. Furthermore, sometimes they get updates on, this is just a social learning process here, what other people are doing. But you often get real feedback from the environment, some real utility to you. And you might have a belief about the utility. You might think that sandwich number 19 hours is the best, and then one day you get a bad one, and you can change sometimes your point on here. Say, that's not a great example. Say you try number 61 and it's amazing. You might shift to a different point here. So that's what's happening in the second part here. So they can have increasing or decreasing uncertainty about their current sort of focal belief, but that focal point can also change based on real world information. Charles.
Would you get something different if you
I don't think so. I think this is a sort of rough baby.
and it may be worth checking out just because a lot of people are, you might get some pushback.
Yeah. I probably should just ever switch to that. But I don't think it would be good.
I'm not clear.
Are there other questions? Okay. So this is the update here. You might get some true utility of something and you have your believed utility. This is just an arbitrarily defined function that shifts your belief. Not all the way to that new point, but in the direction of it. So with that simple setup, the probability with which they get this real world information is the parameter kappa. So when kappa is equal to 0, you can see that this system is already much more kappa, meaning there are more equilibria, or they at least get to many more equilibria. Again, you can see that just by the size of the circle here. Now, as you increase kappa a little bit, it actually becomes more kappa dependent. So you're getting this real world information, and my hypothesis of what's happening there is that that's allowing people to become sort of anchors. They're more disposed to do A or B and continue to do that. And because there are those people out there who are more disposed to that, they create sort of anchor points, which induces more diversity in behavior and therefore and equilibrium points that more diversity that would be there. Keep turning up kappa though, and kappa dependency starts going down. So at this point, it's back to where it was at almost 0. Kappa was 0. Turn it up to 0.5. I don't have that graph here. It's not kappa, which makes sense. You have a bunch of external information, and all you're doing is trying to fit your behavior to that external fitness. So this is the original model, the threshold model. Slightly path dependent in some areas, not path dependent in others. Kappa equals 0, so just adding the social part of the learning increases path dependency. Or sorry, I definitely put these. This should be kappa 0 here. This is 0.5. I'm confused. These are accurate. So this is kappa equals 0. Some path, there's much more path dependency than the threshold model. You can get more path dependency by sort of injecting more external information. But then it goes down, and then eventually it disappears. Okay, so what I've shown with those two models is that one is sort of path dependent, the other has a lot of path dependence. Turning to an empirical case, I spent a lot of time thinking about changes in the American automobile fleet. In particular, you can see that the number of trucks per person on the road has increased a lot. This is the entire pretty much time series of automobile ownership in the US. And starting in the 70s and 80s, it really took off. Now, if you break that down into state cases, individual states, you actually see a lot of variation in the number of trucks on the road. Zooming in a little bit closer to our period of interest, starting in the 50s and up to the 70s, it was actually pretty flat line, but there's obvious fixed effects, different states have different percentages of trucks on the road. You can see here is an example of fairly similar states, pretty different rates. What I do is sort of create a fixed effects model where I say, take the number of trucks that were in the state in 1975, so 1980, and then I look at the uptake rate relative to the national trend of each individual state. So what you're seeing here is a lot of variation between states and their uptake of trucks. So you could account for this change, or rather, both the change and the variation in the change structurally in sort of a microeconomic sense. There's a lot of different things that could explain this. You could say the technology has just gotten better. Trucks are superior. People always had a preference for this style of vehicle. They just didn't exist yet. Now they exist. Now they start to buy it. Great. Maybe there are price or income effects. Change in price might explain the change, but maybe people are getting richer. They can now afford the vehicles that they wanted. That might explain it. Could argue family size. So I'm not explaining why these aren't, why I don't think that these are viable. I do actually attempt to control for this. So the larger vehicles had existed for a long time, and the design process is very long in automobiles. So it's not like new models that were being introduced were of superior quality. Sort of a quick sketch of why the technological improvements might not make sense. Price or income effects. A big cost of driving trucks is gas. Gas was going up. People were very sensitive to that. There was very little change in the relative cost of light trucks. Again, they had already existed. An increase in median income, maybe, but there were also increased prices across the board. Family size might explain. You want bigger vehicles because your families are getting bigger. You don't need to be a demographer to know that American families are getting smaller. That's probably not a very helpful explanation. Perhaps a move away from the urban core. You might want smaller vehicles in the urban core. moving to suburbs might explain why you want a truck. Turns out that that's not really the case statistically. It's actually inversely correlated. More people will have big trucks in urban cores than makes sense. Changes in the nature of employment? No, you probably know that that's the opposite. Fewer people, sort of labor intensive types of work that might necessitate trucks or larger. Other ways of accounting for it might be that manufacturers are really pushing light trucks. It is true that that these trucks are more profitable for manufacturers, but that's to assume the demand. And it turns out that advertising didn't really catch on until later, so it doesn't seem that the causal ordering is right. That they had a bunch of advertisements and people were susceptible to it. Rather, the advertisements followed the uptake of these vehicles. Also, at the time, just looking at the historical record, manufacturers were much more interested in competing with small Japanese imports. There might be policy and regulatory incentives for doing that. That doesn't jive, though, with the state variation, because those are federal level things that really apply everywhere. Nonetheless, we have this variation. So that certainly isn't explaining everything that's happened. And I didn't, by deduction, get to the point of safety. I actually started with the fact that the historical record has a lot of evidence that people were really sensitized to automobile safety. Starting in the 70s, there's a National Academy of Sciences report that's very influential. Ralph Nader, everyone's beloved perennial presidential candidate, who made his name talking about automobile safety. This is when the federal government established the new car safety assessment program and a whole institutional apparatus to help us make sense of safety. So there's a lot of evidence that automobile safety was something that was on consumers' minds. They're spending more time on the road, going further distances, and at one point, 1 out of every 4,000 people was dying on the road every year. And once people were made aware of this, they were much more concerned about safety. So that's sort of my starting point.
Did you say 1 out of 4,000?
1 out of 4,000. Yeah. Dangerous times on the road. So there was a big push. And this is when they first started coming up with crash tests, videos of them ramming cars into blocks. Here's just a simple survey. Unfortunately, there's no good survey data that tracks people's concern with safety over time. This is about the best I could come up with. But you do see an increase in concern for safety over time. This is the last category. Fuel economy is obviously going up. That's slanted against trucks. Dependability, don't necessarily think that should go one way or another. Trucks or cars. Low price, that would favor cars in some ways, but the operating costs of trucks were also higher. So not sure what to make of this. Quality, also not sure to make of this. So here's some evidence that people were concerned about safety. Just something to put up here on the board. But really, it's looking at the historical record. Presidential speeches, Nixon made a speech about it. I'm convinced that safety was on people's mind and influencing how they're making decisions. So I tried to put these various things in a statistical model. I do need to contend, to explain the state level variation is what I'm trying to do with the model. I do need to contend with these other structural factors, like income, education might be a good predictor of what kind of vehicle people buy, whether they live in urban or suburban or rural communities, the number of birth rates for states, again, bigger families might justify bigger vehicles, gas prices. But my more novel variables look at the counts of trucks on the road. So going back to your learning process, if you're trying to make sense of safety, you might be looking around and seeing what other people are doing. So maybe you think trucks are safer. You see a bunch of other people driving trucks. That probably decreases your uncertainty about what is a safer vehicle. And I'm trying to capture that by looking at what I call truck density. So I don't just want raw counts of trucks in the state. I want to look at sort of the probability of seeing trucks, which is dependent upon population, the number of miles people are traveling every year, the size of the roadways, etc. So thankfully, all of these data are out there, sort of to an absurd degree. And that allows me to create this measure of truck density, which is more or less the probability of an individual seeing a type of vehicle on the road in a given year in a given state. But to argue that this is somehow related to safety, I also include fatality differences. So if you look at the trend in fatalities, it is going down over time. Safety is definitely improving. 1 out of 4,000 people dying is a low point. Around 1955. It's been pretty steadily improving since then, but at different rates in different states. So if we look at the rate of fatalities on the road in different states, compare that to the national trend, that seems like valuable information. If you're reading reports in the newspaper that say, Michigan has an above average rate compared to the national trend. We have too many people dying on our road. That's a good piece of information. Even today we have these signs on the highway that say 462 deaths this year on the roads, etc. Try to incorporate that information as well as the interaction term. So the interaction term is, you're concerned about safety because many people have been dying in your state. Also, you see a lot of trucks. I want to say that that relationship would predict the number of trucks on the road the next year. So that's a sort of basic process. And I have a set of models here that sort of capture that intuition. The first one is just a control model to have just the structural elements to explain the outcome of the different rates. I have the second model here because I really have not found a good education variable yet. And what I've done is some interpolation between pretty sparse data points. I think that that's doing some damage. So I run the model with and without that. So basic model, removing that to show the change here. Then again, that the same first variables, the structural variables, plus my novel ones. Model 4, removing education again because I'm worried about the quality of it. To show that actually these variables here, the truck density, the fatalities differences, and the interaction between them actually have a lot of explanatory power. Which is to say that looking at the state level cases, it looks like there's an autoregressive process, meaning that what happens in time t depended upon what happened in time t minus 1. And an autoregressive process is a very good indicator of a path-dependent process as well. So I believe I've observed this autoregressive process here. And I have two models, one that has some path dependency and one that has a lot of path dependency. And my conclusion is that if we were going to say one of these two models explains this outcome, we would want to say the one that has more path dependency, more likely to explain that outcome than the one that doesn't. Therefore, these data suggest that sort of creative learning process would explain this outcome more. It's more likely to explain it than a simple aggregated model. Yeah.
I think I agree that the finding suggests that the model would be, the model that's more path dependent is better. But I think the thing you really need, and then I'm aware of something that's probably different, is right one that you model that where the learning model makes the prediction and the threshold model does not. Right? I mean, that's what you really need, and go find that because then that tells you that the learning model displays something the threshold model can't. Typically, the threshold model does display path dependence, right? And so the question of whether or not this is enough path, or it's too much path dependence to be explained by the threshold. You know what I mean? Like, is in your position of
Yeah, and I think I would need a whole new case. The data that I've been able to come up with here for the automobile case I don't think I can nurse it into that framework where I'm able to do predictions with the learning model that aggregated. Unless you have.
Well, I was just going to say maybe a little bit more about like the nature of the autoregressive process. We talk about when you say path dependent, that can mean a lot of things.
Yep.
And so it seems to me, especially the question of is it, you know, the question if I'm adopting what others are adopting, or am I changing what I'm adopting because everybody else adopted it? You know, like you've got several different parameters in that model, right?
Yep.
About how I respond to the actions of others, right?
Yeah.
And the question is then, do you see the model generates different types of path dependence in the sense of like, it seems to you, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I do have accident rates, so that in some sense is like kappa. And maybe I can do something with that and say, look, this is our kappa,
Right.
And you know, but again, I think it's just more suggestive than it is.
Oh, sure. No,
Yeah.
what I was saying was just the direction, right? So if you could see that, you know, the autocorrective process was positive on these previous, you know, and negative on these other ones, right? And that's the prediction that would come out of the model. You know, this question of, I think disaggregating path dependence between the two models is worth doing. Because I think you're sort of you're getting a lot in path dependence.
I agree.
now.
You know, I have a pretty sloppy definition, rather than measure of that.
That's where you have to start. I mean, because you're looking at it from the outside. But what I'm saying is there might be leverage between the models that you haven't exploited yet, and that could then have a signature.
Unpack that a bit more.
Yeah.
Side comment.
Yep.
There was a time when Michigan was the only state in the union had no speed limit. And the interesting thing, excuse me, is they operate on the German principle. That is, if somebody was overtaken, you pulled off to the other lane. And so I have no idea what the accident was then, but it was very interesting.
Side comment, I drove to Chicago pretty early last Saturday, and that seemed to be an effect. I think that might depend upon density. That sort of rule of everyone to the right, but everyone was in the right-hand lane at like 7 in the morning. Yeah, but then when I came back later in the evening, there were many more people on the road. It was clearly not that. But to your point, there is a lot of state-level variation that I have to control for. It is a fixed effect model, so I'm willing to say, look, there's some variation that we're starting with. But there are a lot of things, and there might be different state-level policies that I'm not incorporating yet and explain this out there. But let's pretend that that's
One last comment there. There is in fact state law that if you see a car disabled off to the side of the road, on your side, you're not allowed to stop. You have to go on and report it. Did I ever see that? That's another one of these adaptations.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So you mentioned in the beginning like the pragmatist, like approach. Did that come into play when determining coefficients for the decisions you make, or how is that in the model?
No. The actors and sort of how they go about updating fit the pragmatist framework.
Okay.
And I do want to be clear that they fit it, but it's not the only thing that fit.
Okay. So could you mix and match with I guess the one was Cartesian. Is it something where you apply different things, or is it the behavior looks like resembles?
More of the latter.
Okay.
That, you know, if a pragmatist, dying the whole pragmatist looked at the model, they'd say that's how I understand social action.
Okay. So you're trying to explain.
Yeah, for more about the politics of sociology, that's why I talked about that rather than, you know, that they have very specific predictions or ideas about it. It's a pretty simple social learning.
This is more of a suggestion than a question.
Yeah.
The readability to grasp with the circles.
Yeah.
Either try going for a color scale or maybe having like a grid so that people can like see the size of the circle relative to a square.
Yeah. I don't remember why I didn't do it. Maybe because it wasn't sensitive enough. I'm sorry?
Color would be more effective, just in ascertaining the relationships immediately.
Yeah.
But there was
I think I had some
reason that was hard because like it's kind of like an optical illusion. Yeah, you know, it's not like one of those
Right,
things
it's
where
hard to
like,
make this
maybe
comparison.
believe that these are all the same size.
Right.
Yeah. You know, yeah.
Charles, do you have
Well,
a question?
just one other quick thing, is just that I know that, you know, I have a little bit of experience of taking some of these methods for audiences that are prone to some other explanation. The folks who talk about scripting and economic relationships, what is their account of novelty or change?
Say that again, sorry.
Like, you mentioned sociologists who would explain economic relationships in terms of scripting, right, rather than rationality. What is their account of change or of novelty in those relationships? Like, how do they explain it?
They don't.
We don't, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good, because then now that gives you a point of leverage, like to be able to say, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not to discredit them.
No.
Because there's a lot of explanatory power. But looking at social systems over long time frames, yeah, they have no real explanation of those scripts.
That's just something, another point where you might have some, you know, purchase and you know, that could get you certain, and you don't have to be confrontational about it, you know.
Right.
But the point is just sort of saying, hey, you know, when you look over a long scale, you know.
That's definitely the sociological audience that I'm addressing.
Yeah.
And that's why it's sort of one of the reasons why I've settled on calling it a constructive process.
Right.
You know, we're actually constructing something here. We're just assuming that it exists, and then seeing the consequences of it.
Right. Yeah. I think that's strong. I think that's a good way to.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.